Coming up next on KPBS Evening Edition, it's the day after cities across San Diego County learned they're about to lose millions in tax dollars.
We'll have the analysis of that story along with the other big events of 2011. KPBS Evening Edition starts now.
Hello, thanks for joining us. I'm Joanne Ferrian.
And I'm Peggy Pico in for Dwayne Brown.
Hundreds of new California laws are about to take effect, including a requirement to teach gay history in public schools, a ban on openly displaying handguns, and a ban on tanning beds for people under 18. Starting Sunday, you won't be able to buy alcohol at a self-checkout line. Illegal immigrants will be able to apply for private financial aid for college, and the sale of the synthetic marijuana called Spice will be illegal. We've linked to a list of all the new laws on our website, kpbs.org.
Governor Jerry Brown's campaign to raise taxes has already raised more than $1 million in just 2 weeks. The governor's proposed ballot measure asked for a temporary increase in state sales tax and income tax hike for California's highest earners. The monetary support for his tax plan came through just 9 donors. The biggest was the California Association of Hospitals and Health Systems. A coalition of Indian gaming tribes also donated heavily, along with the State Building Trades Union. A federal judge has blocked one of the governor's Medi-Cal cuts. Jerry Brown wanted to cut reimbursement to Medi-Cal providers by 10%. The judge blocked the cut to nursing units within hospitals, saying the state did not appropriately review whether Medi-Cal patients would lose access to care. Most nursing units in question are in rural areas. The state plans to appeal. And another court ruling on yet another Brown budget measure is one of the top stories of this year. Joanne looks at those stories with her guest at the Evening Edition Roundtable.
One of the biggest stories of the year happened at the end of this year, just yesterday. In fact, a California Supreme Court ruling effectively killed redevelopment agencies. Millions in property tax dollars that went to city governments will now be diverted back to schools. And that is my segue to our second top story of the year. What's up with education funding? All year, we heard San Diego Unified School District report dire financial straits. And finally, we'll talk about the state of the San Diego media, a new owner at the Union Tribune, and Channel 10 is sold. My guests are Andrew Donahue, editor at voiceofsandiego.org, and Mark Sauer, senior news editor here at KPBS. Thank you both for being here. I'm going to start with you, Andrew. I read your piece this morning about the death of these redevelopment agencies, but first tell us about the birth. How did these agencies come about?
Sure. Well, back in the 1950s, California was looking for a way to sort of refurbish its downtrodden neighborhoods. I mean, this was really set up to take economically blighted and physically blighted neighborhoods and find a way to grow them because the free market wouldn't. Businesses wouldn't go in there and they wouldn't fix them. So the idea was you needed government subsidies. And so you fast forward now to 2011, almost 2012, and it's really evolved into something very completely different. And in my opinion, that had something to do with its downfall.
Well, this is really hundreds of millions of dollars now in property tax money that gets diverted to these agencies in development. How does this affect, then, cities across the county? They're going to lose this money.
Yeah, well, it affects government basically at all levels, all across California. So the cities are definitely the losers. They've been able to basically kind of legally steal or squirrel away the money from counties, from school districts, from other agencies, and spend that just on specific neighborhoods to build big projects and hotels and fix streets and all that kind of stuff. So basically, cities are the losers, but then the winners are perhaps places like schools, the state government, which is in its own fiscal mess, and places like the county and other things like that.
So, Mark, was this an expected decision? Because let's remember, this was a law that the governor signed back in the summer, and then cities challenged this law. So do we expect this decision?
Well, just in the days before it came down, there were indications out of Sacramento that it was going to come down, and I think a lot of folks who were going to be affected had to plan for it to come down. But, you know, as we say, this is a ruling that raises more questions at this stage than really answers, because something will emerge from the ashes here. They will get back to negotiations. They will get back to crafting some sort of new and perhaps reformed, and maybe even the silver lining is, for the cities at least, that it will be even a better system when they come forward, because, as we're saying, it had really gotten away from the original mission. And we talk about places like Coronado being considered blighted, and the money is used to redevelop an old theater, that sort of thing here, talking about stadiums like the Chargers Stadium. Was it really meant for that? On the other hand, you take San Diego's downtown, which was certainly blighted, the old Broadway district down there, and the tattoo parlors and all sorts of things that that really had gone to a scruffy way. And CCDC, the main redevelopment area down there, had enormous success. So it's, you know, a lot of different answers will come as we move into the next year.
So let's move on to schools then. Andrew, I know that Voice has been covering this extensively, as well as KPBS, in terms of San Diego Unified says, look, we may have to declare ourselves insolvent. Does this help?
This kind of, it's not necessarily like a champagne party for them. It's not a huge windfall yet. What it does do is it sort of pushes off what could have been a disaster. Basically, all schools and the state had built all of their planning around redevelopment being killed. And so now that the court has ruled in their favor, they get to keep their money. So they're back, they're in the status quo. The alternative would have been that they lost this ruling and they would have had to make massive mid-year cuts. So what they're basically saying is, yes, we're the winners, but basically it's just a sigh of relief.
What is the fundamental problem with education funding that every year we hear that school districts don't have enough money?
Well, there's sort of two different things. Over the last few years, the state has run out of money, and they have been cutting school districts tremendously. But there's another thing that the school districts don't like to talk about very much, and that is that their costs are going up immensely. They're still getting the same amount of money that they were getting about 10 years ago when you adjust for inflation. But they have a lot of expenses in benefits. They have a lot of expenses in special education. They've cut 15% of their workforce, but they're still paying more in benefits than they were just 4 years ago. So there's a lot of sort of local organic problems in the school districts as well.
When we talk about the state running out of money, though, Mark, we know that education funding has changed in the last 30 or 40 years, that now these school districts have to rely so much more on state funding than local property taxes.
They do, and it always comes back to, you've got two ways of doing it. You can cut or you can raise revenues. Well, in this state, there's been a political logjam, as we all know. The Republicans simply will not entertain any notion of a tax increase. The governor's trying to sidestep the legislature and take that to the people next year if he's successful with that. So
that's the governor's initiative: raise sales tax and income tax on the wealthy.
And have the people vote on that. And if he's successful with that, perhaps we'll see an increase on the revenue side, and it won't all fall to the cuts. But there's two simple ways to do it. You cut your way to it, or you raise revenues, or you get some sort of reasonable balance of both. And it's just been with the two-thirds vote required here to raise taxes, it just hasn't been politically possible, even though the Republicans are a significant minority right now in the state legislature.
Definitely an issue we're going to see more of next year. I want to move on to our next topic, though. His name is Doug Manchester, but you can call him Papa. He is a hotel developer, entrepreneur, and now newspaper owner. Manchester took ownership just weeks ago and already made headlines when he announced he wanted the San Diego Union-Tribune to be the cheerleader for the city. Now, Mark, you used to work at the UT. What do you know about Doug Manchester?
Well, in some ways, this seems to me to be kind of back to the future, because we now have a locally owned newspaper with a very conservative and wealthy owner. With the Copleys for many, many years, we had the same situation. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, when Jim Copley owned it, he died in his early 50s. In the early 70s, it was a very conservative paper in the news columns, not simply the editorial page. And the story assignments and the editors that were chosen and the reporters were chosen all reflected the conservative bent of the publisher. That changed, certainly, in the years I was there in the 80s and 90s. In this most recent decade, Helen Copley modernized it, hired a lot of top editors who'd had success at the Washington Post and other places. A lot of reporters like me from other parts of the country were recruited to come in. And we didn't feel it in the newsroom. The stories you did or the stories you didn't do, that wasn't dictated by the conservative bent of the publisher. She had her editorial page, her cartoonists, her editorials were certainly conservative. But the news, it was very objective. I think Platinum Equity, who's owned it these last couple of years, simply was a business outfit, and they installed professional editors and let it go. So we're going to kind of see local conservative ownership, and whether that translates into the news columns remains to be seen.
Andrew, isn't that sort of the issue here, that we want to hear Manchester come out and say there's going to be a very sharp line between the editorial page and the coverage, and that's not what we've been hearing?
Yeah, I mean, they've really stumbled out of the gate in this. I think people were very skeptical of Manchester already. I can't imagine another person in San Diego who would have elicited such a collective gasp from the community when he took over the newspaper. And so they've stumbled. They've kind of shown that they didn't necessarily know what newspapering was about. And I think the big worry now is everybody's entitled to their opinion, and editorial pages always have their opinion. What's worrisome to me is that they seem to already be taking stances on issues that we don't really know the details about. I think the Chargers Stadium is the big example. They say, well, we're going to use our pages to call out people as obstructionists who are against the stadium. Well, we don't even have a plan. So it's one thing for a newspaper to come out strong for something it believes in after it's investigated it and studied it and used its moral force. But here we don't even have a plan. So this could be a horrible plan for taxpayers, and no matter what, they're already saying they're going to be the cheerleaders for it.
We've got 20 seconds left, Mark. Who bought Channel 10?
It was the Scripps, which is a national firm based in Cincinnati, a longtime San Diego media name. And J.W. August, managing editor, a good friend, says that he's very encouraged. A lot of investigative reporting, a lot of professional reporting across the country with that chain.
Mark Sauer, Andrew Donahue, thank you both for being here.
We'll look back at some of our favorite stories of the year in just a moment. But first, Mexican gray wolves are making a comeback in San Diego's backcountry, and the art of the cocktail makes a comeback in downtown San Diego. This is KPBS Evening Edition.
Tonight on KPBS. At 8, PBS's longest-running public affairs series, featuring Washington's top journalists analyzing the week's top news stories on Washington Week. Then at 8:30, a cross-media initiative built around a wide community of journalists and producers with input from an engaged audience. Need to Know. And at 9, it's The Troubadours, Carole King and James Taylor, and the rise of the singer-songwriter. That's tonight on KPBS.
It's a region of majesty and mystery, home of the tallest mountains in the world. Monty Python's Michael Palin journeys across the lands in the Himalaya range to explore fascinating places.
And there you are, signing Sincerely Yours, James Bond. Exactly.
It's a 2,000-mile adventure filled with discovery and humor.
I don't think I need any fillings, do I?
Himalaya with Michael Palin.
Join the adventure Monday at 10 on KPBS.
KPBS Evening Edition is made possible by Joan and Erwin Jacobs and by
State wildlife officials say they've tracked the first wild gray wolf to enter California in more than 80 years. The wolf came into the state near the Oregon border. That news brought to mind one of our favorite stories from 2011, saving the Mexican gray wolf in San Diego's backcountry. The story from KPBS reporter Susan Murphy and video journalist Katie Ufrat.
A vibrant chorus cascades down the mountainside near Julian. The talented vocalists are gray wolves. They roam in a 50-acre conservation and research facility known as the California Wolf Center. Aaron Hunt is the center's general manager.
Here at the center, we have 23 wolves. We have 6 Alaskan gray wolves. And these Alaskan gray wolves are here for education and research purposes. We also house Mexican gray wolves, which are critically endangered, with only about 50 living in the wild today.
Mexican gray wolves were nearly extinct in the 1970s, with just 5 remaining in the wild. But the survivors were captured and a species was saved. Today, the Wolf Center is part of a national effort to give them a second chance.
We have had 1 pack of wolves born here actually get to go out into the wild. They lived successfully in the wild for many years, and the alpha female of that pack has offspring that are still currently living in the wild, so she definitely left her imprint on the recovery program.
3 more wolves are set to be released this fall or winter to the reintroduction area along the Arizona and New Mexico border. The wolves that are reintroduced have very limited human contact.
You don't want to release a wolf that's gotten a little too used to being around people by being in the captive environment. So we here at the California Wolf Center work really hard to make sure that our wolves are maintained in as wild a state as possible.
These Mexican gray wolves thrive here within these fences. Just this past April, 4 pups were born, but once they're released into the wild, they face many challenges.
Once the Mexican gray wolf is released into the wild, that's where a lot of the work really begins.
Chelsea Davis is the center's animal care and facilities manager. She says the wolves in the wild are monitored and checked weekly.
One is we do howl surveys, so they'll go out actually at dawn or dusk around peak activity times for wolves, and they'll actually try and get wolf packs to howl. And you can tell 2 individuals and 2 pups.
Another way is through special microchipped collars.
A lot of times you're expecting that the wolves will stay in the area where you release them, and then you find out they're 60 miles away from that by the end of the week.
The wolves are also observed to make sure they're hunting and eating the right prey, such as elk and fish. That's because the reintroduction area is federal grazing land where roaming cattle and sheep often become tasty temptations. Historically, wolves were killed by ranchers for attacking livestock. At the Wolf Center, they're experimenting with a taste aversion, which is lacing meat with a nausea-inducing chemical. Dan Moriarty, a professor of psychological sciences at the University of San Diego, is using the technique to teach captive Mexican gray wolves that eating sheep will make them sick.
Some people have described this as a process of going from yum to yuck. You know, it tasted good when you first encountered it, but after this illness episode, it simply doesn't taste good anymore.
Moriarty says the question is whether the learned aversion during captivity will be enough to prevent the wolves from attacking livestock in the wild.
It certainly is going to be enough to prevent them from eating, and it's hard to imagine why a predator would attack something, you know, logically, why would it attack something that is distasteful to it. So the real answer is going to come with the field trials.
Moriarty is hopeful the aversion will be an effective tool to boost the number of successful reintroductions. The goal is to create a thriving ecosystem, just like their sister, the Alaskan gray wolf, has done in the northern Rockies. They, too, were on the brink of extinction and were reintroduced in the wild starting in 1995.
So in Yellowstone National Park, when wolves returned, they kept the elk herds on the move, and they also were keeping the number of sick, injured, and very old and very young animals down to a minimum. So the herds as a whole were healthier, and they were moving around more often. This prevented overgrazing, which allowed willow and aspen trees to return and thrive. With the return of the willow and aspen, we saw a decrease in erosion of the stream beds in the riparian ecosystems, or river ecosystems, in the park, which meant that songbirds, fish, amphibians, beavers, and all sorts of other life could return to those areas.
That's why there's such excitement over 4 Mexican gray wolf pups born at the center earlier this year. Hunt says they'll likely be selected for breeding or release.
Could take several years for anything like that to happen. Like we said, they are very young animals right now, but it is definitely potential in their future.
Very cute pups. Now, that story was from Susan Murphy and video journalist Katie Ufrat. After 6 years, conservationists say they're only halfway to their goal of returning 100 Mexican gray wolves to the wild.
Well, another of our favorite stories takes us downtown to a bar that harkens back to an era just before speakeasies, when mixing a drink was a craft. KPBS arts and culture reporter Beth Accomando takes us on a clandestine visit to Noble Experiment.
The cocktail is an American invention, and when William Powell used to mix a drink, he made it look like something special.
On a Manhattan, you shake to foxtrot time. A Bronx to two-step time. The dry martini, you always shake to waltz time.
Noble Experiment in San Diego is reviving the fine craft of making a mixed drink, and it's doing so in a unique way. The first thing you'll notice is that you have to send a text message in order to secure a reservation. Then, as David Clouden says, you have to find the place.
In the back of a certain restaurant, you walk in the back, past the restrooms, you'll see a freezer, you'll see a ladder and some old beer kegs stacked up here. So what you do is, hopefully you have a reservation, push on the beer kegs. This is the secret door. It's not that big a secret.
Now you're inside Noble Experiment.
When I came to Noble Experiment and saw what Anthony was trying to accomplish here, I was so relieved that there was a place that had this kind of attitude about the cocktail.
And that attitude is one of craftsmanship, because when done right, a cocktail can be a thing of beauty. Which brings us to something else that makes Noble Experiment unique: ice.
A cocktail should be very cold. This was really cold, like to the point where you could almost not touch it when I started. And it's still cold and good. I recognize when somebody passionately cares about something enough to do the research. And it was clear that somebody here had done their homework.
And that person is bartender and manager Anthony Schmidt.
You have to use incredibly good, hard, cold ice. So if you use cold draft ice, which they do here, and you use hand-cut ice, or hand-cracked, then it won't melt as fast, it won't ruin the quality of the drink. So ice is very important.
This type of ice, and the reason why we purchased this ice is because it's crystal clear. There's no impurities. It's the same ice that they would use for ice sculpting.
Schmidt purchases 300 pounds of this ice every other week to use in what he calls spirit-forward presentations,
where the spirit is by far the emphasis.
Each cube is hand-carved.
And I'm just working the corners off. Here's where I'm making a slight V. You can see most of our glassware actually has that V shape, so then it fits nice and neat. I have to be mindful that every block I use, every piece is, carefully shaped. And that's takes its time.
Time well spent, because ice can alter the quality of a drink. Schmidt uses a second, less clear kind of ice for drinks mixed in a shaker can.
Less air inside the ice means denser ice. So we can shake harder, we can stir a little bit longer, we can control temperature. I don't want to just start shaking right away, especially if I've just taken the ice out of the freezer. The ice is brittle, so after we've cut it and we're storing it, and we pull the ice right out, the ice would just shatter as soon as I would start shaking it. I really want it to keep its form. So I give it a quick warm-up. And then I go into my... That pounding is the goal. And so I can't do that unless I have those perfectly fit ice cubes. Again, fit to design this. You can see it's fleeting. It won't be there forever. It's like you'll see me when I make a drink, I'll be anxious if someone doesn't sip right away. The froth on the top of the drink you can't compete with that presentation. It's the aroma that you get from your first sip is so memorable and so profound. It's what Harry Craddock in a classic cocktail manual claims as the laughter of the drink.
And it's the ice that lets him create that laughter and much more.
It gives us more flexibility with the presentation so that when all the drinks are finally on the tray, they're going to be right.
That pleases patrons like David Clouden, who want to savor their drinks.
By far the finest cocktail bar in San Diego, and probably one of the best in the country, if not the world.
That was KPBS arts and culture reporter Beth Accomando imbibing the fine spirits of Noble Experiment. This is KPBS Evening Edition.
I'm Ray Suarez. On the next news hour, Judy Woodruff talks with Iowa Republicans about the upcoming caucuses, plus the analysis of Shields and Brooks. That's Friday on the PBS NewsHour.
The American people have named PBS
the most trusted source of news
and public affairs
for the 8th year in a row.
Trust.
The American people have spoken.
Thank you.
Where can you learn the history and uncover the treasures of our region? Right here on KPBS. First, on Ken Kramer's About San Diego, discover the little-known stories behind the things and places in San Diego we see every day. Then on Crossing South, host Jorge Meraz explores Baja, Mexico, and gets to know the places frequented by the locals. Get to know the people, the food, and the customs of our neighbor to the south, only on Crossing South. Thursday starting at 8 on KPBS.
Welcome back to the Public Square on KPBS Evening Edition. Yesterday, a California Supreme Court decision killed redevelopment agencies. Some of you had something to say about these agencies. Douglas Scott of San Diego writes, perhaps redevelopment funding could be recast using a new, more restrictive formula such that 80% of each incremental tax dollar in a designated redevelopment zone could go to funding education, and the remaining 20% could be used to fund both affordable housing and clean up true urban blight. Under no circumstances should redevelopment money be used to fatten the bottom line of sports franchisees. Len writes on KPBS.org, San Diego is run by and for developers and a few wealthy wheelers and dealers. Anything that reduces the influence of them on the city is welcome. Well, if you've got something to say about this issue or there's something else on your mind, just drop me a line, jfarian@kpbs.org, and let me know if I can use your comments and your name on the air.
We're going to wrap up this final evening edition of the year with a different kind of look back at the top stories of 2011, set to music.
The words were written by Voice of San Diego arts editor Kelly Bennett, the music by Ludwig van Beethoven.
And it's sung by the San Diego Master Chorale. Yes, it is. Our thanks to Voice of San Diego and NBC San Diego for providing that video to us.
And if you'd like to see it again, we've linked to it on our website, kpbs.org.
All of us here wish you a safe and happy new year.
We'll see you again in 2012.
Tonight on KPBS. At 8, PBS's longest-running public affairs series.